Hello and welcome to this, the first in a series of presentations to celebrate 200 years of St Austen's Church in Wakefield, the anniversary of which will be celebrated in 2028. So a few words first of all about the image here on this first slide, which shows St Austen's Church interior in around 1890. We can see two statue niches on either sides on the walls, and the pulpit on the right hand side of the church near the sacristy, both of which were removed in the refurbishment of the 1950s. We can see gas lamp tridents above the benches on the edges of the benches and wooden framed stations of the cross. The door to the left in what is now the old baptistry was a confessional, and although we can't see it here, the name on the door is Father Camelocker, who was in the parish from 1888 to 1890, and this helps us to date the photograph. The quote above the sanctuary along the top of the walls above the columns is from the book of Malachi and reads, "From the rising of the sun even unto the going down, my name is great among the Gentiles, and in every place incense shall be offered unto my name." The picture behind the sanctuary is a copy of the Taking Down from the Cross from an original by Annabel Carracci, which hung at the time in Stonyhurst College. But are we rushing ahead of ourselves here? St Austen's was built in 1828, and the plaque on the wall outside the Lady Chapel facing Wentworth Terrace reminds us of this. So why are we talking about 200 years of St Austen's Church in 2024-25 rather than in 2028? Have we miscounted? Well, it's certainly true that St Austen's Church was opened in 1828, but the planning and preparation behind this major undertaking dates to a number of years previously. So in the presentation here, we're going to look at the timeline for some of the key developments leading up to the opening of the church. So on the slide here, we can see the timeline. Essentially, this is the outline of the presentation we're going to look through today. Events lasting from 1823 right through to the opening of the church in 1828. And the first main event we want to look at is in November 1823, when the land on which St Austen's was built was purchased from the estate of Thomas Rishworth. We have in our possession within the parish archives a copy of the agreement which was signed, and it lists the people who vouched for on behalf of the church in Wakefield, which are listed here on the slide. We have Charles Waterton, the famous naturalist who had land in Walton and of course had his land at Walton Hall. We have his brother, Reverend William Waterton, who in fact was only just ordained in 1823, and both of Charles and William both offered money to buy the land on which the church was built. We have the Reverend Francis Trapps and Thomas Glover, both of whom were key Jesuits in the area at the time and were responsible for overseeing the Jesuit order in general, but also any developments which were taking place, of which St Austen's was one of the major new parishes being developed by the Jesuits at the time. And here we can see what Wakefield looked like at the time. You can see the land around Wentworth Terrace in 1823 on a map drawn by the surveyor John Walker. You can see that the only buildings on Wentworth Terrace at the time on either side of the terrace are those at the west end, which include the building which eventually became the current presbytery. These are known now as the Rishworth buildings, after Thomas Rishworth. At the time, the land did belong to Thomas Rishworth, and Rishworth Street itself at the bottom of the map there is named after him. According to a conveyancing record, the agreement to sell the land on which the church was built was signed on the 14th of November 1823, as we've seen on that previous slide. And the next event of note took place in 1824. Local press records suggest that the Catholics of Wakefield are interested in using the Chantry Chapel for worship, which seems a little bit unusual, given that we've just seen, 6 months earlier, there's been an agreement made to purchase the land on Wentworth's Terrace. So what's going on here? Let's find a little bit more about this. Well, the local paper, the Wakefield and Halifax Journal, reported discussions underway for the use of the Chantry Chapel of St Mary on the Bridge by Catholics in Wakefield for Mass. The story went on to be repeated in other papers, including the Yorkshire Gazette and the Leeds Intelligencer, but no other evidence has been found relating to these discussions. Well, thinking a little bit about the history of the chapel, the Chantry Chapel of St Mary on the Bridge was built originally by the people of Wakefield, probably in the 1340s, when the stone bridge on which it still stands replaced an earlier wooden one which went across the River Calder. King Edward's role came later in terms of financing the chantry services which took place within the building. It was his money that funded the 2 priests whose job it was to chant masses for the souls of the dead. It stands on one of the stone buttresses supporting the bridge, and it's this fact that probably saved it from demolition during the Reformation, when Wakefield's 3 other chantry chapels were destroyed. By the 1820s, though, that's the time we're talking about in this discussion, the poor chantry was over 400 years old and rather the worse for wear. This image, contemporary image, shows what it probably looked like at the time. Remember that the chantry chapel we see today, if you're familiar with Wakefield, the chantry chapel we see now today standing on the bridge is totally rebuilt from the bridge surface level up by Victorian architect George Gilbert Scott in the 1840s, and the front was repaired again in the mid-20th century. Only the cellar area within the chapel is original. So the chantry chapel of the 1820s would have been a building in very poor repair, as shown here. It had been used recently as a warehouse, a clothes shop, a library, a gingerbread shop, and a corn factor's office. The town would probably be excited by the prospect of the building being repaired and brought back into use as a church, as a place of worship. But if the newspaper report was accurate rather than just repeating local gossip, for some reason the plan just didn't proceed. We might think that this may have been because of the costs of repairing such an old and historic building, but another consideration may have been the size of the chapel compared to the growing Catholic population. We know from the notes of the first parish priest of St Austin's that there were already 60 to 70 Catholics in the area at the time, and a building of this size would have been unable to cater for them. So where did the Catholics of Wakefield go to Mass before St Austin's was opened? Well, Walton Hall, home of Charles Waterton, offered one such option. Charles Waterton, of course, was one of the first people to be concerned with the conservation of the natural world, and he and his family had retained their Catholic faith throughout the Reformation. some of their number being fined or even imprisoned for their faith. Walton Hall itself had been rebuilt by Charles's father, Thomas Waterton, in 1767 as a replacement for their medieval hall which stood on the same site. Included in the new building was a chapel located on the top floor of the hall, and we know that Jesuit priests visited and stayed at Walton Hall throughout penal times. We even know the names of 7 of them who served between 1690 and 1791. The Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1791 removed some of the restrictions on Roman Catholics, including the need to take an oath of supremacy to the king, and it allowed for places of religious worship to be legally registered at the quarter sessions. Thomas Waterton, Charles's father, wasted no time in registering Walton Hall Chapel as a place of worship. The quarter sessions took place, as you might expect, 4 times a year and rotated around the region. One of the 4 sessions always took place at Wakefield itself. But Waterton was so keen to register that he didn't wait for the next session at Wakefield. Instead, he made a registration at Rotherham on the 20th of July, 1791. This states, "I do hereby certify that a congregation or assembly for the religious worship by papists or persons professing the popish religion is intended to be held at Walton Hall in the parish of Sandal Magna in the West Riding, in a certain chapel there. And I do hereby pray that the same may be recorded, pursuant to the directions of an act passed in the 31st year of the reign of His present Majesty, entitled, An Act to relieve upon conditions and other restrictions the persons therein described from certain penalties and disabilities to which papists or persons professing the popish religion are by this subject." And he signs it Thomas Waterton. From this we can be fairly certain that Thomas and Charles Waterton after him arranged for Catholic services in Walton Hall and more than likely allowed local Catholics to attend. We know that Jesuits attended Walton Hall long before 1791, and it's likely this was going on before the chapel was officially registered. It's just that Thomas is making efforts to make the whole thing legal just as soon as it's possible to do so. Charles Waterton and his relatives among the Jesuit order are known to have played a major role in the founding of St Austin's Church. Later, in 1824, we find that Joseph Ireland, a prominent Catholic architect of the day, has been commissioned to design several plans for the new chapel. They were discovered in the late 1980s in the archives of Stonyhurst. Later that same year, Joseph Ireland is recorded as ordering 200,000 bricks for the building of the new church. Joseph Ireland himself had very close links to the area, as his ancestors had lived in Crofton. Joseph's grandfather, Dr. James John Ireland, was the younger brother of John Ireland, the last lord of the manor of Crofton. To dig a little deeper into Wakefield Catholic history, we know the Irelands were originally from Lancashire and moved to the area in 1613 when their fortunes diminished as a result of the severe taxes on Catholics imposed during penal times. Before moving to Crofton Old Hall, and actually an earlier version of the property shown on the picture here, the family lived on the Nostell estate. The Nostell Priory, which we know, of course, would not be built for another century. Instead, the Irelands lived in this building, a rudimentary hall fashioned from the ruins of the original monastic buildings, the original Augustinian Priory of St Oswald, most of which was destroyed after the Reformation. This is a painting of it preserved in the Bodleian Library, with a copy held in West Yorkshire Archives, which is used here with their kind permission. Sadly, even this building was swept away later when the elegant mansion was built by the Wynne family in 1733. But back to Joseph Ireland, our architect, and the plans made for St Austin's Church. Before we look at Joseph Ireland's plans, it might help to know that the original ground plan for the church, both the original plans and whatever was originally built, was a freestanding building with space on either side. What you see here is the church shown on the 1848 Ordnance Survey map a few decades after the church was built. Note there is a gap between the Rishworth buildings, the current presbytery, and the church entrance. There are no buildings on Wentworth Terrace from the right-hand side of the church through to Northgate at this time. So with this in mind, let's take another look at Joseph Ireland's drawings. So this is one of Joseph Ireland's drawings shown with the same orientation shown on the plan on the previous slide. Some things to point out on this plan are the proposed presbytery or chaplain's house. This is situated to the right and slightly behind the church as seen from Wentworth Terrace. There is an elaborate entrance portico shown on the left-hand side. Let's look at this in more detail. So we can see 6 columns outside the church in front of the entranceway with steps leading up to the entrance. Ireland drew an elevation plan of what the entrance would look like. Remember, this is an entrance which would have been facing the Rishworth Street building, what is now the presbytery, with little space between the two. There wouldn't have been much opportunity for those approaching the church to appreciate the full splendour of the entranceway, as they would be approaching from the side up a relatively narrow alley. It's little wonder this idea was not pursued in full. However, if we want to get a better idea of the effect that Ireland was hoping to achieve, we can just look at his chapel in Hessop, near Bakewell in Derbyshire, which he designed and built less than a decade earlier. This church was originally built by Joseph Ireland for the local Catholic landowner Francis Eyre of Hassop Hall in 1816-17. As such, it's somewhat smaller than St Austin's and has just the 4 columns instead of the proposed 6. But when compared with Ireland's drawing, it gives some idea of the effect he was hoping to achieve. It should be noted that the entrance portico is not the only element of the Hassop Chapel which Ireland attempted to recycle at St Austin's. In some ways, he perhaps saw St Austin's as a larger scale version of his church at Hassop. Needless to say, the entranceway, which was eventually created for St Austin's, was far less ornate than this. Shown on this slide is Ireland's internal plan for St Austin's. You can see the columns around the sanctuary which made it through to the final design and still remain today. But look at Ireland's design for the roof and compare it to what we see at the chapel in Hassop on the next slide. This is the ceiling of the chapel at Hassop, and I think we'll probably agree there's a certain amount of reusing of ideas and architectural styles going on here. Let's go back now to look at the ground plan again. On this plan, the same details of the chaplain's house and the ornate entrance are visible. You can also see the existing Rishworth buildings, including what is now the presbytery, marked on the plan. To the top right of the church, you can also see another building. This is marked School on the plan, showing that the Jesuits had already identified the need for a school to be part of the church. When the church was eventually built, however, the schoolroom was integrated into the design of the church itself. The room underneath the church, used for meeting rooms and events, was the original schoolroom. Father Jarrett, the second parish priest or rector, wrote to the bishop in 1848, "I have on average attending my school about 60. The accommodation is good, a large boarded room under the chapel." This final plan by Joseph Ireland shows something resembling much more the final layout of St Austin's in relation to the presbytery which was built. It should be remembered that when the church was reordered and extended in 1880, the sanctuary was pushed back into what was originally the chaplain's house or presbytery, shown here at the top of the plan. Father John George Morris, the first rector of St Austin's, included this drawing in a report to Father Charles Brooke, the Jesuit provincial, in 1828. He draws both the chapel itself and the chaplain's house, situated to the left here. We can see the entranceway is still to the right, facing onto the Rishworth buildings. And we can see behind the church is a wash house in place of what was originally planned as a school. Between 1824 and 1826, the account books show regular payments being made to William Puckrin, head of a firm of Wakefield builders, who built a modified version of Joseph Ireland's plan. Work was definitely underway by June 1825, when the foundation stone for the church was laid, and by August the Jesuit provincial notes that work on both chapels at Wakefield and Huddersfield is well underway. On the 8th of December 1825, however, the bank of Wentworth, Challoner and Rishworth collapsed. Rishworth was selling the land at Wentworth Terrace, and the bankruptcy which followed may have been responsible for a delay in the church building project. In 1826, or more likely 1827, the first parish priest or rector of St Austin's, Father John George Morris, arrived in Wakefield to take charge of the new parish and oversee the buildings. According to Tommy Timon, the school caretaker and unofficial parish historian of the early 20th century, Father Morris stayed in a house on Little Westgate. Little Westgate is shown here on the various plans. To the left we see the buildings in 1885, and in the top right we see Gledhill's shop, which is on the site of the building in which Morris stayed. In more modern times, William Hill's betting shop now rests on the same site. By 1827, William Puckrin, the builder, is reporting to Reverend Francis Trapps in Pontefract that the roof of the chapel is almost complete, and by January 1828 the church was registered with the local authorities in accordance with the laws of the time, for the religious worship of papists or persons professing the popish religion, as Catholics were known at the time. A copy of the wording is present in the parish archives, although the original is missing from West Yorkshire archives. Finally, in March 1828, the church was blessed by the coadjutor bishop of the Northern District and then opened to much fanfare the following day. Thanks for listening. This slide credits some of the references we've consulted in preparing this presentation. If you want to know more about the history of St Austin's Church, we plan to hold further presentations in the lead up to the 200th anniversary, and these will be made available on YouTube. We would also recommend Dennis McNiff's excellent History of St Austin's Church, Wakefield, 1828 to 1931. This is now available on Amazon. There are also other books on the history of St Austin's you will find on Amazon, which may be of interest. Thank you.